Hi everyone, this is Miss Lasar and welcome to our next lecture video. This week's topic is a cool one that I bet you have some experience with. This is food webs and trophic interactions. So you know by this point how we take notes. This will be an outline format and you will make sure your numbers and letters are vertically aligned. You'll pay attention to how much you've tapped in. If it's in black, you must write it down. If it's in blue, it is optional to write. And remember to pause the video to write down notes when you need to. I will probably go too fast, so don't be afraid to pause me, rewind, rewatch, and get all of the learning that you can out of this video. So let's dive into our first section. Capital A, matter versus energy. And you'll learn so much more about this in chemistry next year, but let's start with the basics. Detail one, matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. Matter is made out of atoms. They're connected together into molecules. You can see on the right-hand side a water molecule that's made up of three atoms, one oxygen, two hydrogens, and those atoms are connected together by a chemical bond. So this is a structure that's pretty typical to matter. It's made of atoms connected together into a molecule. Number two, energy is the ability to do work. And there's tons of types of energy. We'll talk about light energy, chemical energy, kinetic energy, which is the energy of motion, potential energy, which is stored energy. But the critical thing to know here in blue is that molecules, like our water molecule that's on the screen, or the molecules that are in your food, in your body, etc., are matter that have energy stored in their chemical bonds. And that's in blue because that's a concept that you should be familiar with from middle school. But if you're not familiar with that, just add it into your notes now. Make that number 3 in section A. So if you look at our water molecule, those chemical bonds that are indicated connecting the oxygen to the two hydrogens, those are not physical objects. That is a way of representing the energy that is used to hold those two atoms together. That's chemical energy stored in the bonds of a molecule. All right, we're ready for big letter B, capital B, food chains and food webs. Detail one, a food chain is a linear sequence of organisms in which energy and matter is passed as one eats another. So here's the connection to matter and energy. We've got our leaves on the bottom left. They are eaten by our insect. All of the matter that was in those leaves, the molecules in those leaves, is now moved into the insect. The insect will actually break some of those molecules apart to use the stored energy in those molecules and will keep some of those molecules on its body. The molecules it keeps allows it to grow bigger and gain mass. And maybe when it's big enough, it gets eaten by a rat. Molecules, including the matter and energy in those molecules, get passed into the rat. If our rat is eaten by an owl, the molecules of the rat containing matter and energy are passed into the owl. But this simple food chain is too simple. We know that there is not just one sequence of leaves eaten by insect, eaten by rat, eaten by owl. Our owl has multiple food sources. Our rat has multiple food sources. That's represented in number 2 under capital B, a food web. A food web is an interconnected diagram that shows all eating relationships and all matter and energy transfers in an ecosystem. And you can see on the bottom of the screen a food web from an underwater ecosystem in a pond. You can see how the algae and the waterweed are eaten by the prawns, the carp, the fly, the slug. Our fly is eaten by a dragonfly. Our dragonfly is eaten by a frog. And we have lots of different food sources in a complex web of interactions. Here's another food web. This is a food web from a forested ecosystem in Western North America. This would be in the Pacific Northwest around Washington State and Oregon. We've got lots of different plants at the bottom of our food web that are eaten by lots of different plant-eating animals, like the Pacific tree frog, the Edith's checker spot butterfly, and the Douglas squirrel. Those become food sources for our next level up, which become food sources for our next level up. So we need some vocabulary here. We're ready for section C, capital C. organisms' roles in food webs. Because when we look at a food web, we know that we can categorize the organisms that are there based on their role. So let's do that. Let's apply some specific vocabulary. Role number one, a producer. This is an organism that can make or produce its own food. This is usually a plant. This is sometimes a single celled organism that has chloroplasts in it. So these might be some types of algae. This is almost always a plant. The process that we are referring to when we say produce or make its own food is the process of photosynthesis. And we're going to spend a whole lot of time talking through the details of photosynthesis. So when I show you what that is on the next slide, don't worry about writing any of it down. But I just want to clear up a misconception that when we say producers make their own food, we are not saying create it out of thin air. We're saying they don't have mouths and they're not eating large molecules from other animals or organisms. They are doing this. They are taking in very, very small molecules, tiny carbon dioxide molecules and tiny water molecules, and they're also taking in energy. Producers are able to absorb and capture light energy from the sun. And they'll use that light energy in order to take the atoms of those carbon dioxide and water molecules and squish them together into a much larger molecule. Glucose, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, that large molecule that you see on there. That glucose molecule and 6 small oxygen molecules are what are created during photosynthesis. But they're not created from nothing. They're created by rearranging the atoms of other smaller molecules into this bigger structure. And glucose is what we're referring to as food. Glucose and larger molecules like glucose, which is a carbohydrate that you might have heard of, are the food that we're talking about when we say you eat food. It's a large molecule made of atoms connected together that's actually storing energy inside the chemical bonds connecting those atoms. Okay, so let's talk about where that food in plants goes. It is eaten by, number 2, consumers. A consumer is an organism that eats something else to get matter and energy. It's usually an animal, a fungus, or a bacteria. You probably didn't think about fungi or bacteria because you don't think about them as having mouths, and they don't have them, but that doesn't matter. What's important is that they're eating large molecules like glucose and other carbohydrates and fats and proteins, and they're going to be using those molecules as their source of matter and energy, not carbon dioxide, water, and light energy. We've actually got different types of consumers, so we're going to expand within this section. Detail A within section 2, our first type of consumer is an herbivore. This is an organism that eats plant material, which can also be said as it eats producers. You can see a lovely caterpillar eating a plant leaf on the screen. This is an herbivore. Detail B, a carnivore, is an organism that eats flesh or meat. You can think of this as an organism that eats other animals or organisms, an organism that eats other consumers. Top carnivores are something that you might hear us refer to. Top carnivores or top predators are those that exist at the top of the food web or the food chain, and they're not eaten by anything else. They only consume meat. This lion or a human would be an example of a top carnivore or a top predator. The lion would be a top carnivore. Humans are not carnivores. We don't just eat other consumers. We eat both plants and animals. We are omnivores. An omnivore, detail C, is an organism that eats both plants and animals. And as you can see from the screen, there's a variety of interesting omnivores across the world, from dogs and badgers to brown bears, civets, warthogs, coyotes, skunks, squirrels, and monkeys. Another type of thing that eats other things, another type of consumer, is a detritivore. This is an organism that eats dead material and digests it internally. This is another way of saying it has a mouth. When we're thinking about a detritivore, there's two awesome examples on the screen. On the left, we have two dung beetles that are eating the decaying poop of animals. And on the right, we have an earthworm that's eating all of the dead organic matter in soil. Detritivores eat mostly detritus, which is leaf litter, decaying matter, and the feces or poop of animals. Arthropods, which includes insects and crustaceans, and worms make up a good portion of the detritivores here on Earth. There's another option though. There are also scavengers. This is in blue, so this is optional to write down, but if this is interesting to you, feel free to write it. You might be thinking about scavengers like vultures or like hyenas. They will eat recently killed animals. This is not the same thing as a detritivore because detritivores will eat things that have been dead for a really long time and contain dead cells, as opposed to a scavenger that's eating more of a fresh kill. And fresh might be 3 days old, but that's still relatively fresh. There are also, detail E, decomposers. These also eat dead stuff. Decomposers are organisms that eat dead material, but digest it externally. They do not have mouths. What you can see on the screen are bacteria on the left and fungi. These are mushrooms on the right. Decomposers are typically bacteria and fungi. They release enzymes that externally digest the dead material. This is like, think about secreting acid onto a dead log that breaks down the dead log into mush, and then that mush is moved into the cells of the decomposing fungus that's eating the dead log. Decomposers are really important in an ecosystem because they actually help recycle nutrients in an ecosystem. They free up all of the matter and energy that's in those dead things and allow other organisms to access it. We're ready for section D. So when we're thinking about matter and energy, we have to think about how it travels through the ecosystem. And this is section D, a trophic pyramid. For this section, you might want to consider drawing a diagram that looks something like the diagram that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen and adding to it as we go. So number one, this is a trophic pyramid. That is a diagram that shows how much energy is distributed in an ecosystem and how that energy is passed organism to organism. Importantly, it's going to show how energy is lost as it gets passed from organism to organism. So in section 2, within section D, we're going to mark our trophic levels. And you're going to see me write down some information about this and also indicate them on the screen. So our first trophic level is the producer level, and you can see that I've put a blue box around producers at the bottom of this pyramid. You already know what producers are. They are organisms that make their own food or produce their own food. But now we're rewriting that. We're writing a producer is an organism that produces their own food and stores the greatest amount of energy. A lot of that light energy that those plants, those producers capture, is stored within the bonds of the molecules within that plant. Producers will always be at the bottom of the trophic pyramid, and they keep most of the energy that they make. Moving up a level, detail little b, primary consumers. These are the first consumers, or the organisms that eat the producers. These are also known as herbivores. So now we're getting some terms that are analogous to each other. Primary consumers and herbivores means the same thing. When we say primary consumers, we're thinking about the amount of energy that they keep versus lose. Primary consumers are more active than producers. They have to move around as opposed to those producers, plants, which stay in one place. So they're going to spend more energy. They also need to digest their food, so they lose some of the matter and energy that they consume. We'll learn about that later. That's going to be a process called cellular respiration. Moving up a level, we're going to look at the things that eat those primary consumers. That is detail C, secondary consumers. These are the second consumers, or the organisms that eat the primary consumers. These might be carnivores or they might be omnivores. And secondary consumers have to chase their food. because they're not eating still plants, they're eating animals that move around. So and they also have to digest it. So they're also going to lose some of the energy that they consume. They're going to lose that matter and energy to the surrounding environment as they break it down and use the energy that's stored within. Finally, we get to detail D, tertiary consumers. These are the third consumers, or the organisms that eat the secondary consumers. These could also be carnivores, or they could be omnivores. And these are usually the top predators or the top carnivores. In some complex food webs, there can be a level higher than this that is called the quaternary consumers. But on a quiz, on a test, on an assessment, we will require you to know the vocabulary up to and including tertiary consumers. So section E is a little bit of clarification as we move into our food web analysis. You will be creating food webs. Section E are the 3 rules for creating food webs. Rule number 1, plants or producers always go at the bottom. Take a look at the food web on the right-hand side. You can see my producers on the bottom row. That's what you are aiming for on a food web you create. Detail 2, the highest trophic levels are at the top. You can see that very clearly in this food web. Really, you want all of your arrows to be pointing upward. You want to make sure that every arrow points upward. It will make your food web much easier to interpret. And detail 3, those arrows point from the E10 to the E-ter. So if I look at my food web on the right and I look at the plants, I see arrows pointing away from the plants to the pika, the red-breasted nuthatch, the Pacific tree frog, indicating that those animals are eating those plants. Make sure your arrows are pointing in the right direction. Arrows show the directional flow of matter and energy from one organism to the next. When an organism consumes something, it is consuming matter and energy that moves into its body. So take a look at this food web. This is practice. See if you can fill in these blanks. In this food web, blank eats blank. See if you can answer that. Pause the video. Maybe you said something like the bald eagle eats the sea ducks eat the benthic invertebrates eat the phytoplankton. That would be right. Who are the producers? That would be our phytoplankton, our submerged aquatic vegetation, and our vegetation. Even though I don't recognize those terms, or I might not recognize those terms, I can tell those are the producers because there's no arrows pointing toward them. They are not eating anything. They're also at the base of our food web. Those are all clues. Where are the highest trophic levels? They are up here at the top. Our osprey and our bald eagle are the top predators in this environment, the highest trophic levels. Okay, so section F, trophic cascades, is going to rely heavily on this interesting food web. You do not need to copy this onto your paper. Trophic cascades is where it gets really fun. See if you could finish the sentence. If the population of blank crashes, then what will happen? Let's look at antelope. Antelope are frequently hunted by humans for food, for pelts. Let's say they're overhunted. Their population crashes because too many of them were hunted and killed. What would happen next? Well, antelope eat grass. And with fewer antelope, more grass will be able to grow because it's not being eaten. And so the grass population will increase. But let's look at the other direction. Antelope are eaten by coyotes. Our coyote population will slightly decrease because the coyote is losing a food source that it relies on. These are all called, detail 1, direct effects. Direct effects are a change to one population that causes a change to another population that is directly connected to that species. So our original change happened to the antelope, and coyote and grass are directly connected to that antelope. There's just one arrow connecting them to the antelope, which means that any impacts to the coyote and grass population are direct effects from the antelope population crashing. But we can go beyond that, because when our antelope population crashes and our grass population increases, that means that our marmot has more food available to it because there's more grass now. So our marmot population might increase as well. And if our marmot population increases because they have more food, well, then there's more marmots, which means more food for bears. And so our bear population might increase. Looking at it another way, if we have fewer coyotes, we are going to have a little less predation on our beavers. There's a little fewer coyotes eating our beavers because they lost one of their major food sources. And so we lost some coyotes too. Our beaver population might increase because there are fewer coyotes. If our beaver population increases, well, they normally eat willows. More beavers means less willows, as those willows get eaten by the increased beaver population. And we can keep going throughout our whole food web, but we're going to stop it there. So these impacts on bear, beaver, marmot, willow that aren't directly connected to our antelope, these are, detail 2, indirect effects. These are changes to one population that cause a change to another population that is not directly connected to that species. So one or more species away in our food web. And we can see that our marmot, our beaver, our bear, and our willow are not directly connected to our antelope, which means that impacts on them are indirect effects. This is called, detail 3, a trophic cascade. Indirect changes to an ecosystem that are triggered by the addition or removal of a top predator. Let me show you an important example. On the left, we have an intact ecosystem from Yellowstone National Park. Gray wolves at the very top of that food web were eaten, were overhunted by humans and essentially removed from the Yellowstone National Park area. When the gray wolves were removed from the Yellowstone National Park area, elk populations boomed, causing massive declines in producer populations that the large elk population ate. Eventually, the ecosystem collapsed. In that example, our wolves were acting as, detail 4, a keystone species. This is a species in a high trophic level, so we're thinking a top predator here, that helps to maintain the biodiversity of an ecosystem. When they are removed, the diversity of the food web collapses. And this is a little counterintuitive because what we're saying is that other organisms indirectly depend on the keystone species for their survival. It doesn't seem intuitive that the plants in Yellowstone National Park depend on the wolves to stay alive. But they do, because the wolf population keeps the elk population in check, which means that the elk population doesn't overeat all of the plants in the area. But when the wolves are removed due to overhunting, there are too many elk because they're not being hunted by wolves, and they eat too many plants, and the ecosystem collapses. Detail 5 is another important species, a foundation species. This is a habitat-forming species that has a strong role in structuring the ecosystem. And I mean literally, like literally providing a physical habitat for other organisms to live and survive. Some examples are coral. The coral is an animal that forms coral reefs, which provides a home to countless species. The trees in forests, the kelp that form kelp beds, the seagrass meadows. These provide spaces for breeding. Think about a bird building a nest in a tree. The tree is providing a habitat for the bird. That's a foundation species of the forest. Foundation species are usually producers. Not always, though, because coral is an animal and they form coral reefs. Foundation species are usually producers. They're usually dominant in an ecosystem, so we see tons of them, and they provide essential ecosystem services. However, they can also be found at any trophic level. There are some cool examples of alligators digging holes into the ground that fill with water, and those little holes or depressions provide crucial water sources to other animals during a drought. So it can be at any trophic level. And finally, detail 6, our final species for today is an indicator species. This is a really sensitive organism, an organism whose presence, absence, or population size reflects a specific environmental condition. Here's what I mean by this. They indicate the health of the ecosystem, like how polluted an ecosystem is. If it's too polluted, they won't be there. If it's very polluted, maybe they're the only things that we see there. How acidic or basic the ecosystem is, how salty it is, how oxygenated it is. If you ever did a stream study in outdoor education and you looked for some organisms in the stream, Some of them were pollution sensitive, and if they weren't there, that meant that there was pollution in the stream. But some of them were pollution tolerant, and so if they were there, that meant there might be some pollution in the stream. So this is a pretty cool class of species. And this is our final detail for today. There's tons of other organisms that we think about and tons of other relationships that we think about in an ecosystem. But this is a good introduction to some of the complex relationships. And I hope you enjoyed thinking through how organisms within a food web interact. Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure your notes are super complete, and we'll see you in class.